We are talking about Daniel. In case you haven't been around for a while, talking about Daniel. So go ahead and turn there. It is after Ezekiel. Again, highly recommend using your table of contents if you need to look that up. No problem there at all. So take a few minutes and review as a group, like kind of flip through the book, chapters 1, like just from the beginning up through chapter 3, verse 7. You don't have to go over everything, but just kind of retell the story in your own words. So pause it, flip back through, retell it in your own words, and remember what happened. So, King Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue and commands everybody to bow down and worship it. So, we see in this story up through verse 7 that all the people in this field, this massive people in this plain, they all bow down and worship. And we should take notice, think, well, what about Daniel and his friends? Like, that's who the book's about. Like, what about those guys? Where are they when this is happening? Did they bow down too? What's going on? So we read further and we get a kind of a zoom-in story about some specific events that are happening. So pause and read Daniel 3, verses 8 through 12. So we saw that out of the whole breadth of people that have come in, that the king is summoned and called to him for whatever reason, all these people he's drawn to himself for this statue worship crusade. Everybody bows down except for 3 dudes. Sometimes taking a stand means standing alone. Can you imagine the pressure that these 3 guys were under? So again, try to put yourself into this setting. Anytime you're reading kind of a biblical narrative, try to put yourself in their position and think about it from a lot of angles. There's this massive plain, there's thousands of people there. If you've been to Momentum, like, it's going to be more people than that, like tons of people. There's this big old gold statue, and nearby, probably what they used to help forge the statue is this ridiculous massive furnace. And this king, who, quite frankly, in this time frame, may be the most powerful king in the world, doesn't really matter, but he's a big deal. And he says, if you don't bow down, you will be thrown in this furnace. Period. Like, that's it. So when all this music plays, there's this big triumphal, musical, glorious extravaganza. Everybody falls prone, go prostrate. They all like down. And I'm guessing in order to not be killed by the king and to not have people think that they didn't really bow down, I'm guessing people like threw themselves onto the ground flat. And they weren't just like, oh yes, we bow down. No, I'm guessing they're terrified of this guy. He's kind of crazy, right? Remember, he's already ordered the death of dozens of people because no one could tell him what his dream was, right? So, he's not really all there. So these 3 guys keep standing. There's people literally laying down all around them. Thousands of people laying down, and these 3 guys are just not laying down. Now, we don't know if these 3 were next to each other and they kind of had that solidarity in the face of this opposition, the face of this pressure, or we don't know if they were kind of in their own places doing whatever jobs they're doing with all these other people, and they were the only 3 that didn't stand down, and they didn't know. maybe they didn't have a chance to be like, dude, we're not bound down, right? No, we're not bound down. It's an idol. Like, that's a direct command from God. Like, no, we're not bound down. We don't know if they really had that opportunity. They might not have. They could have been totally by themselves and still chose to stand. So, this is a pretty big pressure situation. Pretty big pressure situation. And they're able to stand up against it and still follow through on what God has called them to. But sometimes, no matter if there's a big crowd around, like in this situation, or maybe your situation is really small and there's only a couple people around, taking a stand for God is still taking a stand for God. And the most important thing to remember is that no matter who is around or who isn't around, this same God in the text, Yahweh, still sees us. And he still sees when we take a stand for him and follow through in obedience when the pressure's on, or when we don't really want to, or when it's going to be awkward and uncomfortable. The God of the universe still sees us, even if nobody else does. So go ahead and pause and read what happens next, Daniel 3, verses 13 through 18, and then reread the last two verses, 17 and 18, and in fact, then go through and underline the phrase, but even if he does not. Okay, so pause, 13 through 18, 17, 18 again, and then underline the phrase, but even if he does not. So, I want to focus on the phrase. Go to verse 17, and the phrase, it says, is able to. Because what they're saying here, I'm going to look at it and read it in mine. If the God we serve, then, well, this version says, then he can rescue us from the fiery blaze. So, here's the point. Like, is able to, or if he can, whatever it is, underline that, or box it, do something, circle it, star it, whatever, because we're going to talk about that phrase. Because there's a Hebrew word, you can write this in your margin, that is probably going to pronounce it wrong. That's fine. But it's called, it says Yakol, Y-A-K-O-L. And this is used somewhere else. Because here we see in the text, we might be asking ourselves, maybe these three guys aren't sure if Yahweh can save them. So you're like, well, if he's able to save us, then he will. So we're like, wait, do they think he can save them? Do they know enough about God? Like, what's happening? Do they actually believe he can save them? So let's go back in time and see when this phrase is used earlier in the Bible. So right in there next to Yakol, Genesis 37, chapter 4. Take a minute and read that together. And what's happening there is that's when Joseph met his brothers pre all the slavery and going to Egypt and whatnot, when there was still just a lot of animosity. They hadn't yet tried to kill him, or they hadn't yet sold him into slavery. And the same word is used. It says the brothers were unable to greet Joseph kindly or with respect. Now, does this mean like something was like wrong with their vocal cords and they were physically unable to greet Joseph? No, of course not. That's ridiculous. So we can assume the same thing here with God. It's not a question of whether or not God is able to save them. We see earlier in Daniel who's the God that controls governments and sets up authorities and has all sorts of power to do whatever he wants. It's clearly Yahweh. So they know that he has the ability to save them. What they're actually saying here is if God is willing to save us, if it is in accordance to his will, then he will. And if it's not, he won't. And even if it's not what he intends to do for us, we will still not bow down and worship in the face of death. So, this is incredible to me. So their safety might not be what God has planned for them. And these three guys know it. That's basically what they're saying. They're saying, we're not going to worship this idol, even if that means death. We know God can save us, but even if he chooses not to, we will still not worship you. We will still not worship this idol. Because they don't know if God has their physical comfort, their physical safety, their physical life. They don't know what God has in store for them. And even though they don't know, they're still willing to obey and to trust him because they know who he is and his character. They're still willing to trust him, even though they're not sure that God has their immediate safety in mind. That's a pretty big point. So we don't face this size of a challenge very often, right? We don't have someone come up to us and say, worship this idol or we're going to kill you. It does happen occasionally in our society, but not very frequently at all, and not on a daily, regular basis. But what about smaller daily decisions? Kind of like we talked about earlier. What about how do you respond and treat your parents when you're grumpy in the morning? Or how do you respond to your siblings when they're being really annoying and you're just in a foul mood anyway? Taking a stand for God is still taking a stand for God. Or how do you respond to that one kid at school that you really don't like and they're super annoying, but you know that God has called you to love that kid? Are you going to take a stand or not? Or when you're on the social medias, whatever it is, what are you going to look at? What are you going to spend your time doing? Are you going to take a stand for God and obey him and do what he's called you to? Or are you going to give in and lay prostrate to the idol? We are faced with hundreds of decisions every day, hundreds of opportunities to glorify God with our actions, or are we going to lay down and worship the golden idol? We're not going to be perfect, but that's the good news of the gospel, is that God knows we're not going to be perfect, and Jesus already lived the perfect life for us, and we get that record of perfection. So don't hear me trying to make us feel guilty and shameful and dumb for always making mistakes, but I think we need to be honest with ourselves. And sometimes it's kind of fun to kind of pretend, oh, would I be able to stand up in their place, and would I be able to do that and take a stand for God and face the fiery furnace? Maybe, but right now, that's not what God is calling you to. Right now, God is calling you to take a stand and share your faith with that friend, to take a stand and not laugh at those same kinds of jokes that those other guys are telling, to take a stand and to love your siblings the way Jesus has called you to. He's asking you to take a stand, fill in the blank. So, go ahead and pause and read Daniel chapter 3, verses 19 through 25, and then retell what happened in your own words. So we see that, these poor guards, these poor fellows, these guards that obey the king and do what he says and chuck these three guys into the fire, they die because they obeyed the king. And the ones that disobey the king don't die. So this is pretty ironic. It's a top score for irony there. Awkward. Wonder Who else noticed these things that are around the king at this point? So they're in the furnace, and there's not just three of them anymore. There's a fourth dude in there walking around. Who is this guy, right? We're like, is it an angel? Is it Jesus? Is it God incarnate come to hang out with them? Like, what's going on? The text isn't really very clear, and we don't need to speculate about who this fourth person is specifically at all. That's not the point of the passage. The point of the passage is God is physically with them through their fire. He doesn't just spare them from the fire and save their lives. He spares them and saves their lives, and he demonstrates that he is with them through the trial. He's right there with them. That's really cool. We don't serve a God who saves us and leaves us alone, or just lets things happen without him being around. He wants to be there with us, beside us, so we can trust him, rely on him, and be there with us. Whether he saves us from physical harm or from a fiery inferno or not, he is there with us the entire time. And that's what God is demonstrating to these three gentlemen. This is really cool. God says, I am here with you through this really intense time. I'm right here. It's going to be all right. So, go ahead and pause and read the last three verses of chapter 3, 26 through 29. Do that. So we have more irony, right? So the king can't even control these men that obey him and throw them into the fire. They're dead. Oops. These three guys that disobey him, he's trying to kill them. They don't die. So then the king's like, oh yes, let's worship. We all will worship Yahweh now. And anyone who doesn't, they will die. Like, well, you've just proven you can't control who is going to die or not. Until, without God's authority, you can't do that at all, king. Sorry. Like, you've just tried. You've just demonstrated your inability to control death. This threat is kind of awkward and a little bit ridiculous. So we are forced to kind of wonder, though, what's going on with King Nebuchadnezzar? Is this a real heart change? It's a pretty quick switch. He just spent who knows how many millions of dollars to build this giant gold statue, commands everyone to bow down and worship himself through this statue, and then sees a demonstration of Yahweh's power and says, oh wait, let's worship this God now instead. He's clearly super powerful. So on the surface we see the king has turned to God. But we don't know how much of this is a serious heart change in the king's life. How deep does this decision really go? We're going to find out in the coming chapters, spoiler alert. But here's what I want us to wrestle with a little bit. How deep is our decision to follow God? When we're faced with difficult things, are we more often bowing down and worshiping ourselves and doing what we want to do and turning our back to God? Sometimes I do. Not proud of it. I don't like it. Sometimes I do. So I want us to spend some time really thinking and talking. What does our decision to follow God look like? How does that play out in our daily lives? What can we see in our own life that is fruit? That we can see God at work and see heart change and see him working on us. And what does it look like to continue to learn about his character so that we can trust him like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even though we don't know if God has our primary safety in mind? Because we do know that he does have ultimately what is good, just, and right in mind for everyone. And sometimes that means suffering so that other people can see how we respond when we suffer. Like we talked about the interesting times a couple weeks ago. Sometimes God wants to use painful circumstances in our lives to show other people that He's real in our hearts and in our lives, so that they can be drawn to Him and have a relationship with Him the same way we do. So talk about those things together. Love you guys. See you next week.